find myself from time to time in my Christian life presented by an opportunity to serve, but not wanting to because of past sin. You know, it may have all been dealt with, but I still have feelings of inadequacy and I don't want to do it. So I'm absorbed by the question of how do I get back to where I need to be spiritually? You know, the disgrace is mine. I brought it on myself. I might have fixed up few of these things. How do I restore meaning and purpose in my life once again? Now, God's people in the last 3 chapters of Nehemiah find themselves in this very same space. The pieces have been repaired, the walls and the laws, but they're still not connected. They're not the shining light that God wanted. These last chapters of Nehemiah answer that question for God's people, and they give us a plan for restoration as well. Now, a bit of a warning before we go further. Because of the size of the text, it's 114 verses, I've needed to be selective about what we read today. So I'm putting stuff on the screen in an abbreviated form, but I do really recommend reading the full text this week to check out my methods, to look at all the things that I've missed, because there's so much in these 3 chapters that could be of use to you. So let's get on with it. So let's start by looking at Nehemiah chapter 11 verse 1 through to chapter 12 verse 26. We're going to consider just a couple of key verses here. There's a lot more that you can get into if you want. In chapter 11 we find that it's moving in day, finally. The city needs to restore its population. It's not got very many people living in it yet, so that it can function as a commercial and as a defensive centre. But it also needs to renew its population to restore the nation's spiritual life. So in chapter 11 verse 1 we see the people being organised to come and to live in the city. So let's have a look at that. Nehemiah chapter 11 verse 1. Now the leaders of the people settled in Jerusalem. The rest of the people cast lots to bring 1 out of every 10 of them to live in Jerusalem, the holy city, while the remaining 9 were to stay in their own towns. The rest of the Israelites, with the priests and the Levites, were all in the towns of Judah, each on their ancestral property. Now this balance of population being created here was pretty normal for the time. Unlike modern times where more than half the population lives in cities. In ancient times, very few people would live in the cities themselves. Cities were really city-states and very connected to their surrounding lands for resources, because you wouldn't want to walk far for your fish. In turn, cities would provide defensive refuge, commercial opportunity and governance. Additionally, if the city was the centre of worship for a particular religion, it would also be known as a holy city, as we saw Nehemiah call Jerusalem in verse 1. This would mean that the religion would be based there and would be central both to the life and to the purpose of the city. But to help us understand the relationship of Jerusalem to the land, here's a map that I created. And blue pins show the towns at the approximate boundaries of the province of Judah. You can find these towns mentioned in chapter 11 verse 25 through to chapter 11 verse 36. You can see Jerusalem is clearly labelled there, but at the top right the blue pin is the location of Bethel. At the top left is the location of Ono, notably where his adversaries wanted to lure Nehemiah into a trap. At the bottom left is the town of Beersheba, and at the bottom right is the location of Dibon. This means that overall the province of Judah was stretched about 80 kilometres south of Jerusalem, about 20 kilometres north, and as wide as I guess was about 40 to 50 kilometres wide. And as you can see on this map, this is quite a substantial and very mountainous area to govern. But, this was more than just about moving in. It's more than about setting up the secular city-state. If you go back and you read from chapter 11:1 to chapter 12:26, you'll see lists of names of people, and those lists connect them to their heritage. They connect them through bloodlines back to the people from before the exile. In amongst these lists of names, you'll also see the names of positions that connect them to David's design in Chronicles for the place that God chose for his name, Jerusalem. The list includes priests, Levites, gatekeepers, temple servants, and the worship team, who's still around, and that's pretty awesome. Interestingly, there's no mention of civil government or focus on commercial building projects like Haggai criticised them for in his book. Jerusalem is to be a holy city, connected by heritage through his people and through its structure to God's design, and governed by God's people as well. This was well established, and about 100 years later, when Alexander the Great came to conquer, it wasn't the nobles or the city elders who came out to meet him. In fact, it was the high priest to read Daniel to Alexander. Alexander saw himself in Daniel's prophecy, and he decided not to sack the city but give it a great lot of respect. Spiritual governance is of great value. And that's really what Nehemiah is establishing here. He is connecting them. Nehemiah's plan is not just to move people in, it's to restore their connections to each other and to the plan that God had established through his servant David for their spiritual governance. And that's where we need to start too. We all had a plan once, and maybe it needs a bit of renovation, but paint on the walls. But we need to engage with God's plan for our lives and really live it out if we want meaning and purpose in our lives. And that's step one. Restore your spiritual life. Right, so moving on. Next we see Nehemiah dedicating the spiritual life of the city. You see, it's not just enough to reconnect the spiritual life. It sits there, all right? It's set up everything. But we need commitment to ensure that our restored state survives to fill its purpose. To do this, we need to dedicate ourselves and our lives to the Lord. If we lose focus on who we serve, we're going to fail. There's no doubt about that. So let's take a look at Nehemiah's dedication in this passage from chapter 12, verses 27 to 43. Nehemiah 12:31 says, I had the leaders of Judah go up on top of the wall. I also assigned 2 large choirs to give thanks. One was to proceed on top of the wall to the right, toward the dung gate. By the way, Ezra was with this mob. The second choir proceeded in the opposite direction, and I followed them on top of the wall together with half the people. And at the gate of the guard they stopped. That's towards the northern end of the city. Then the 2 choirs that gave thanks and took their places in the house of God. The choirs sang, and the sound of rejoicing in Jerusalem could be heard from far away. This is Nehemiah 12:39. Now, as I said before, this is more than just a simple housewarming. When the people walked along the walls, they could review their work and be reminded of just how far they'd come. They could see the state. Finally, their city was finished, and the province of Judah was restored. Their disgrace, the cause of so much ridicule and distress from the surrounding nations, had been removed. Giving thanks to God, they walked along the walls. They dedicated the work of their hands to God and to his purposes, and celebrated with great joy. No tears this time. And you can see here, I've got a little map here which shows the direction of the 2 different groups. They started at the top right-hand corner there in that sharp point. And Nehemiah went one way with his group, and Ezra went the other way with his group, and they met in the top left-hand corner and then ended up in worship in the temple. It would have been great for them to actually see the work of their hands finished. And this says to us something. It says, if you want to succeed, if you want to have real meaning in your life, you need to dedicate yourself to God's purpose in your life. And what that means is action on our part. The act of dedication focuses your life. It helps you preserve the spiritual life that you've restored. So find a way in your spiritual walk with others, in the church, in the home, in small groups. Celebrate the wins and explore God's word together. It will draw you closer to him and secure you in times of distress. So, moving on to the last section here, which is primarily chapter 13, but it starts in Nehemiah 12:43, where we're looking at Nehemiah reforming spiritual life. We've got into the city, we have dedicated ourselves, and now we're looking at some things which happen afterwards. There's a famous saying that a battle plan never survives the first engagement with the enemy. Once you're set up and going, history teaches us that failure is just round the corner unless you plan to deal with the unexpected and the predictable failures that are all going to come along. Now, I've chosen one of Nehemiah's battles from chapter 13 as an example of how to deal with the adversity when it comes. There are a number of others here that you can read through as well if you like, and I highly recommend it. They all follow the same basic pattern, so that's why I'm concentrating on one. But this particular one has a direct connection to the running battles with our Lord in the Gospels. So, let's read on. Nehemiah chapter 13 verse 15. Now in those days I saw people in Judah treading wine presses, and they were doing all sorts of other work as well, bringing all this into Jerusalem on the Sabbath. Now you know where I'm going with this. Therefore I warned them. Notice that he warned them there. People from Tyre, who also lived in Jerusalem, were selling in Jerusalem on the Sabbath to the people of Judah, who should have known better, I guess. So I rebuked the nobles of Judah, and I said to them, "What is this wicked thing that you're doing, desecrating the Sabbath day? Didn't your ancestors do the same things, so that our God brought all this calamity on us and on this city? And now you're stirring up even more wrath against Israel by desecrating the Sabbath." So I stationed some of my own men at the gates, so no load could be brought in on the Sabbath day. Once or twice, the merchants and sellers of all kinds of goods spent the night outside Jerusalem. Must have been rocky and hard. But I warned them, and I said, "Why do you spend the night by the wall? If you do this again, I will arrest you." Now clearly they'd rebuilt the prison. From that time on, they no longer came on the Sabbath. Then I commanded the Levites to purify themselves and go guard the gates in order to keep the Sabbath day holy. One of the questions here we face is, was Nehemiah just following the rules? What was his heart about? And sometimes we get lost in building of walls and all the civic sort of things that he's doing. Nehemiah 13:23 actually leaves us in no doubt about where his heart was at, because it follows that little clip there. It says if there was any doubt about Nehemiah's intentions, he wasn't just following the rules. This, just following the law. This verse shows you his heart. In Nehemiah 13:23 it says, "Remember me for this also, my God, and show mercy to me according to your great love." It's the relationship with God that Nehemiah is working on. It is the relationship of God for himself and for the people. You'll notice that Nehemiah doesn't compromise. He's on the lookout for compromise. He spotted what was happening on Sabbath days, and he clearly doesn't want a repeat of the past exile. So he identifies and exposes that compromise. Then he really gets up and personal and direct in the face of those who are responsible. Notice that he warns the people who are actively doing it, but then he goes to the nobles and he absolutely tells them off because they're responsible. In fact, they may have been actually driving this activity as well. They were certainly assenting to it happen, consenting to it happen. Having gone through and told off the nobles, yet again, seems to be a theme in this book, he then goes and he establishes a reform to address the compromise, to make sure that it doesn't happen again. Initially, he uses his own men. He puts them at the gate and he tells off the people who come to sleep under the walls himself. He tells them off. But ultimately what he does is he tells the Levites, "Hey, go guard the gates, you gatekeepers. Make sure that only the spiritual commerce happens inside of Jerusalem on the Sabbath day, not all this civil commerce." I wonder though, somehow, how much do we compromise? Do we see the compromise, or are we complicit sometimes? No. And I have a question for the church at large, are we headed for our own Babylon? Also, I suspect that this particular act, or acts like it, that Nehemiah forms here, is the root and the start of the Pharisee tradition. They certainly took this up with Jesus when he was healed on the Sabbath. Nehemiah may have been a little bit frustrated by the challenges that he faced in the final chapter of this book, but his reforms stood in the face of the Greek and the Roman empires. Israel never returned to idols, and the governance that he set up worked really, really well. In fact, when the Romans invaded, normally what they would do is they would take the capital city and they would fill it full of Roman things. Roman banners, Roman theatres, Roman gods. But these spiritual leaders were actually very clever. They said to the Romans, hey look, why come all the way up the hill? That's a big walk. Caesarea, much nicer place, go there. And in fact, Romans made that their capital city. What the priest said to the Romans was, instead of you setting all these things up and causing riots, because that's what would happen, there was still some Romanization that was going on. There was a Roman garrison, etc. But they said, instead of you setting up all of this sort of Caesar worship, which would cause riots, why don't we offer sacrifices on Caesar's behalf? And that worked for them up until AD 70. Nehemiah's efforts also set the stage for an angry young man reforming the money changes in the temple some 400 odd years later. His work survived. His work provided that stage for Jesus to stand on. And eventually was redeemed us through his blood on the cross and clear view of this city. So I'd like to ask you a question. Are you part of that reformation? I realise that I've been talking mostly to Christians today about connecting, about restoring their spiritual lives. Do you need to join? Do you need to start your spiritual walk? Lastly, maybe you're sitting in your own empty Jerusalem, wondering where to go right now. Perhaps your spiritual life needs just that touch more renovation. Even if you don't need it right now, one day you will. Remember God's plan of restoration for his people. Reconnect to your spiritual heritage. Connect back to those patterns that you once knew. Or connect afresh to God's heritage for you. Dedicate your life to keep true, to maintain that spiritual heritage, to maintain purpose and meaning in your life. And reform any wandering to keep God's plans. That way you will establish meaning and purpose in your spiritual life once again.